Welcome, friend. Tonight, we explore the everyday lives of ordinary people who navigated the changing world of the Victorian era. Before we begin our journey, go ahead and get comfortable. Let your head find that perfect spot on your pillow and allow your shoulders to relax. There is nothing else you need to do right now but breathe deeply and listen. I wonder, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Is it late evening, or are you stealing a quiet moment away from a perfectly chaotic schedule? Wherever you are, I am so glad you are here. If our stories bring you a little peace, a simple follow on your app helps other weary travelers find this quiet space too. Now, with your eyes gently closed, let the sounds of your room fade away. We are no longer in your time. Instead, we find ourselves standing on a damp cobblestone street as the 19th century unfolds. All around us, life is moving at a new, relentless pace. The world for 10-year-old Thomas was a constant tremor. It was not something he heard, but something he felt deep in his bones, a hum that traveled up from the floorboards through the worn soles of his shoes. This vibration was the first thing he felt in the morning and the last thing he felt at night. A ghost limb that shivered even when he was tucked into his narrow bed. The mill was a living thing, and its heartbeat was the floor beneath him. It was a rhythm that defined every moment, a constant reminder of where he was and where he would be tomorrow and the day after that. This ceaseless shudder was the background to his entire existence, a physical presence as real as the wooden splinters he sometimes got in his fingers. From this deep, vibrating pulse came the sound. It was a harsh mix of 1,000 chattering voices, the frantic clatter of shuttles flying back and forth, the groan of gears, and the high-pitched scream of spindles turning faster than the eye could follow. The noise was a solid wall, so dense and unyielding that spoken words simply broke against it. Because of this, Thomas and the other children had become experts in a silent language. A sharp nod from the overseer meant work faster. A quick flick of the man's eyes toward a loom meant a thread had snapped. Thomas had long forgotten what it was like to have a conversation at a normal volume. Here, understanding came from watching faces and hands, not from listening to voices. His role in this great, noisy dance was that of a piecer. The word itself described his whole purpose. When a delicate cotton thread broke on one of the immense spinning mules, a machine as long as his entire house, it was his job to fix it. He would have to dart under the heavy moving carriage of the machine, his small body just able to fit in the gap, and find the two broken ends. His fingers, though nimble, were permanently stained with dark machine oil and crisscrossed with tiny white scars from cuts and burns. With a deft twist, he would splice the ends together, making the thread whole again so the machine's hungry work could continue without pause. This work left its mark not just on his hands, but inside his chest. A fine, almost invisible dust of cotton fibers was always present, clinging to his clothes and hair. He felt it with every breath, a tickle in the back of his throat that often turned into a deep, racking cough, especially at night. Some of the older men, their faces pale and their breathing shallow, seemed to carry the mill inside them, their chests rattling with every movement. Thomas tried not to think about that. Instead, he focused on the feel of the thread, the quickness of his fingers, and the constant, careful calculation of moving in and out of the machine's path before the heavy carriage returned. When the midday bell rang, the great machines did not stop, but the workers were allowed a brief pause. Thomas would find a small space on the floor, tucked away from the main aisles, and pull out his lunch. A single, dense piece of hard bread, sometimes with a sliver of cheese if his mother had been able to afford it. He ate slowly, his ears still ringing with the phantom clatter of the spindles. The noise was so ingrained in him that silence itself felt strange and loud. Chewing the tough crust, he watched the mill owner's son, a boy about his own age, walk through the factory floor with his father. The boy wore a clean wool suit, his shoes so polished they reflected the weak light from the high, grimy windows. The sight of the boy in his fine clothes planted a strange feeling in Thomas's stomach. It wasn't simple envy. It was a deeper, more confusing resentment that he had no words for. He looked from the owner's son's spotless hands to his own, which were smudged with grease that would never fully wash away. He saw the boy's easy posture and felt the ache in his own back, a dull throb that was his constant companion. The boy looked at the machines with a distant curiosity, as if they were animals in a zoo, while for Thomas they were demanding, dangerous partners in a day-long struggle. This stark difference between their two worlds felt like an injustice he couldn't name. This feeling lingered long after the owner and his son had departed, leaving the scent of clean wool and soap behind them. Thomas returned to his work, his movements perhaps a little slower, his mind snagged on the image of those polished shoes. He wondered what it would feel like to walk without the floor trembling, to breathe without the taste of cotton, to end a day with clean hands. The thought was so alien, so impossible, that it felt like a story from another world. He pushed it away, focusing again on the threads, on the rhythm of his task, because thinking about such things made the ache in his back feel heavier. Finally, after hours that stretched into a gray eternity, a new sound cut through the din, the piercing blast of the final whistle. It was a signal of release. The massive machines began to slow, their frantic chatter winding down to a tired groan, and then, at last, to a humming silence that left a painful ringing in Thomas's ears. All around him, bodies straightened up, shoulders slumped with fatigue. Workers, young and old, moved like a single weary river toward the doors, their faces smudged with grime and exhaustion. The sudden quiet felt unnatural, making everyone's shuffling feet and tired coughs seem startlingly loud. Thomas joined the slow-moving crowd, his small body lost among the adults. Outside, the Manchester twilight was settling, the sky a smoky purple from the countless chimneys that dominated the horizon. He clutched the few pennies he had earned in his hand, the metal cool and solid against his palm. The vibration of the mill floor was fading from his bones, but the deep ache in his muscles remained. He knew the feeling would still be there in the morning, when the whistle blew again, calling him back to the noise and the dust. He began the long walk home, his mind empty of everything but the thought of a bowl of thin soup and his bed. The owner's son was probably sitting down to a warm dinner in a quiet room, a fire crackling in the hearth. The thought didn't feel as sharp now. It was just a dull, distant fact, like the smoky sky above him. He wondered, with the simple, tired curiosity of a child, if tomorrow would be any different from today. He suspected, with a certainty that settled heavily in his small chest, that it would be exactly the same. Around the shadowed lanes and crowded tenements of the city, the familiar sounds of evening life began their steady, ancient rhythm, replacing the clamor of the machines with something older and more human. The day was done, but another, just like it, was waiting. While the great machines ground on in Manchester, life in the countryside moved to a different, older rhythm. Here, for a young man named Arthur, the day began not with a whistle's shriek, but with the cool dampness of the earth seeping through the leather of his boots. He followed the plow, his steps heavy in the freshly turned furrow, the rich, dark soil clinging to him like a second skin. This was a world measured in seasons, not hours. It was a place where time was marked by the shifting light and the familiar calls of the birds that nested in the hedgerows. The feeling of the soil under his feet was as much a part of him as the beat of his own heart, a constant presence that connected him to every man in his family who had walked these same fields before him. This seasonal pulse was the only clock he had ever needed to know. He could tell the coming of spring by the first call of the cuckoo, a sound that promised longer days and the slow greening of the pastures. Summer was the scent of cut hay drying in the sun, a sweet, warm perfume that clung to his clothes and hair for weeks. He knew autumn by the crispness in the mornings that made his breath cloud before him, and winter by the sharp bite of frost on his cheeks as he broke the ice on the water trough for the cow. These were not mere observations. They were experiences woven into his very being, a cycle of work and rest, of planting and harvest, that felt as natural and unchanging as the rising of the sun itself. That same predictability was present in his father's movements beside him. They worked in a silent, synchronized partnership born of years of shared labor. His father would swing the scythe in a wide, powerful arc, and Arthur would follow, gathering the fallen stalks into neat sheaves. There was no need for words. A slight nod, a glance, a shift in posture was all the communication they required. They moved as one, two parts of a single purpose. Arthur felt a deep comfort in this shared effort, in the steady, reassuring presence of his father, whose hands were as calloused and strong as the ancient oaks that bordered their small plot of land. Their life was hard, but it was known. Every part of it understood. But a different kind of talk had recently disturbed this familiar peace.
His cousin, returned for a brief visit from Manchester, had spoken of a world that Arthur could barely picture. He described buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the clouds, and streets crowded with more people than Arthur had seen in his entire life. The cousin spoke of factories filled with iron machines that spun thread faster than 100 women could, and of wages, real wages, paid every week in solid coin. This was a concept almost foreign to Arthur, whose family lived by what they grew, trading surplus eggs for salt and a portion of their grain for the right to live on the land. His father had spat on the ground at the mention of it, dismissing it all as a godless chaos, a noisy, dirty place where a man lost his soul. He spoke of the freedom of the open sky and the honesty of working the earth, his voice filled with a conviction that Arthur had never heard waver. To his father, the city was a trap, a place of temptation and ruin, and the steady chime of a factory clock was the sound of a prison bell. He saw no promise in it, only the loss of a way of life that was simple, true, and ordained by God. He warned his cousin that the clatter of machines would deafen him to the important things, like the song of a lark or the rustle of wind in the barley. Arthur, however, had listened to his cousin's words with a secret, troubling curiosity. While his father heard only noise, Arthur heard the possibility of something more than the endless cycle of debt to the landlord. The idea of earning coin, of holding money that was his own, planted a seed of restlessness in his mind. He imagined buying new boots instead of patching the old ones for the 5th time, or having enough food stored that a bad harvest wouldn't mean a winter of gnawing hunger. He saw the weariness etched into his mother's face and wondered if the city, for all its strangeness, might offer a life where her hands weren't perpetually raw from work.
And then there was the new sound, a sound that had only started in the last year or so. On a clear day, when the wind was right, a low, mournful whistle would carry across the fields from miles away. It was the train, a line that had been laid through the valley, connecting the distant towns to the great cities. It was an alien sound in this landscape of bird song and wind, a metallic cry that cut through the peace of the countryside. To his father, it was an unwelcome intrusion, a scar upon the land. But for Arthur, it was a constant reminder of the other world his cousin had described, a world that was moving faster than his own. The sound seemed to pull at something inside him, a strange mix of fear and longing. Each whistle felt like a call from a place he couldn't see, a promise of a life that was not governed by the rain or the sun. The tension grew sharper when the landlord's agent came to the cottage, his horse trampling the small garden by the door. The man had announced, without apology, that the rent was being raised again. Arthur watched his father's shoulders slump in defeat, saw the flicker of fear in his mother's eyes, and felt a surge of anger and helplessness. The familiar fields, which had once felt like a comforting inheritance, suddenly seemed more like a cage. Later that afternoon, he stood alone in the barn, the scent of dried herbs and old wood familiar in his nostrils. He ran his hand over the scythe his father used, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark from the grip of his father and his grandfather before him. The tool was
perfectly balanced, an extension of the arm, a piece of his family's history that he could hold in his own two hands. It represented everything he knew: the dignity of labor, the connection to the land, the long, unbroken line of his ancestors. He had always assumed that one day his hands would be the ones to wear its handle even smoother.
But as he stood there, the distant whistle of the train sounded again, faint but clear. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the source of that sound, a powerful engine of iron and steam, pulling people towards places like Manchester. He thought of his cousin's description of pulling a lever, of making a machine move with a simple touch. It was a different kind of power, a different kind of work, a different kind of future. The choice felt impossible, a chasm between two worlds. He was caught between the smooth, worn wood of the past and the imagined cold, hard iron of a future he could not yet see. The scent of the damp earth lingered in the quiet barn as Arthur was left to wonder if his hands were truly meant for the familiar curve of the scythe, or if they might one day find themselves shaping a different world altogether. Eliza's days were not marked by the sun's rise or fall, but by the sharp, insistent jangle of a bell. Her life was a collection of sounds, each one a command that pulled her from one task to the next. The first bell, before dawn, was a harsh clang from the housekeeper's room, a signal to rise from the thin straw mattress in the cramped attic she shared with two other maids. A shiver always ran through her as her bare feet met the cold floorboards, a chill that seemed to live permanently in the bones of the house's lower levels. Down in the scullery, a basement room where daylight was a distant memory, her work began. The stones were slick with a constant dampness that worked its way into her woolen dress, and her hands, still soft from the countryside, were quickly becoming chapped and red from the endless pots that needed scouring with harsh lye soap and coarse sand. This world below the main floors had its own unspoken rules, a map she had to learn quickly. The most important territory was the kitchen, ruled over by Mrs. Gable, the cook, a woman whose face seemed set in a permanent frown of disapproval. Eliza learned to move silently in her presence, to anticipate the need for a basin of water or a freshly peeled potato without being asked. She learned that praise was non-existent, but a quiet grunt from the cook after a particularly well-scrubbed pot felt like the highest of compliments. From the other maids, Sarah and Jane, she learned the rest of the household's geography. Never make eye contact with the master of the house, Mr. Henderson, when he passed in the hall. Always curtsy to the mistress, even if her back was turned. And save any whispers or shared complaints for the brief moments of rest in the shared attic room, where their hushed voices were the only warmth against the drafts. This intricate dance of deference was complicated by the house itself, which seemed to be at war with its own nature. The mistress, Mrs. Henderson, clung to the ways of her mother's generation. She insisted the butter be churned by hand in the pantry, a task that fell to Eliza on Tuesdays, her arms aching from the repetitive motion of the wooden dasher. The mistress claimed it produced a superior taste, a wholesomeness that factory-made butter could never replicate. Mrs. Gable, the cook, agreed with a vigorous nod, muttering about how things were done properly in the old days, before every convenience was designed to make people lazy. This respect for tradition governed the polishing of the silver, the beating of the rugs, and the endless task of keeping the coal fires lit in every room, a job that left a fine layer of soot on everything, including the inside of Eliza's throat. Mr. Henderson, however, was a man enchanted by the new. His pride and joy was a recent installation at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room he called the water closet. It was a strange and unsettling marvel. Instead of the simple privy at the back of the garden, this contraption was a gleaming porcelain bowl, connected to a web of lead pipes. A pull on a brass chain would unleash a startling roar of water that swept everything away into some unseen underground destination. Mrs. Gable viewed it with deep suspicion, convinced it would bring unhealthy river air into the house. "It isn't natural," she'd grumble, scrubbing a carrot with unnecessary force. "What was wrong with a pot and a walk to the garden? It's what decent people have always done." Eliza, tasked with cleaning the device, found it both terrifying and magical, a piece of some future world that had landed in their midst. The tension between these two worlds often crackled in the air. One afternoon, while on her hands and knees scrubbing the front hall, Eliza overheard the master and mistress in the parlor. Their voices, usually so calm and measured, were sharp with disagreement. Mr. Henderson was speaking with great excitement about a new invention he had seen, a sewing machine. He described how it could stitch a seam faster than 10 women working at once, a marvel of gears and needles. He spoke of efficiency and progress, of how it would free up the mistress's time for more refined pursuits. Her reply was cool and clear, carrying easily into the hall where Eliza tried to make herself invisible against the wall. "My mother's linens," the mistress fed, her voice laced with disapproval, "were stitched by hand. There is a quality to it, a human touch that a machine cannot possibly replicate." Eliza paused her scrubbing, the wet rag growing cold in her hand. She thought of the endless mending pile that awaited her and the other maids each evening, their fingers pricked and sore from sewing by the weak, hissing light of a single gas lamp. The master's machine sounded like a miracle, a release from hours of tedious labor. Yet the mistress's words echoed the cook's feelings about the water closet, a belief that the old, familiar ways held a certain virtue that was being lost. Eliza found herself caught in the middle of their argument, a silent observer to a battle being fought not with swords, but with new-fangled conveniences and deeply held traditions. She wondered which side would ultimately claim victory within the walls of this house. Life for the servants was lived in the margins of these grand debates, in the spaces the master and mistress never saw. The attic room was their sanctuary, a small world of its own under the slate roof. After the final bell of the night released them, they would climb the narrow stairs, their bodies tired from more than 12 hours of labor. Here, they would share a cold slice of bread and whatever gossip they had collected throughout the day. Sarah might mimic the way a visitor had peered at the furniture, while Jane would recount a near disaster in the dining room when a gravy boat was almost overturned. They spoke of their homes in the country, of families they missed, and of small dreams for a future that seemed impossibly distant. In these moments, huddled together for warmth, Eliza learned that every household had its secrets. She heard about the master's younger brother, who had apparently lost a great deal of money on a bad investment in railway shares, a topic never mentioned below stairs. She learned that the mistress received letters from a sister in India, letters that sometimes left her looking sad for days. This secret knowledge was a form of power, however small. It was a currency traded in whispers, a way of understanding the powerful and unpredictable figures who controlled their lives. It made the Hendersons feel less like distant gods and more like ordinary people, with their own worries and weaknesses, even if they lived in a world of comfort Eliza could barely imagine. As the weeks turned into months, Eliza's hands hardened, and the rhythms of the house became her own. She no longer needed to think about which bell meant what. Her body simply responded, moving toward the scullery, the parlor, or the kitchen as commanded. She learned the specific creak of the third step on the main staircase, and the particular way the wind whistled through the window frame in the master's study. The house was no longer just a place of work, but a living thing she was coming to understand. Yet the central question remained, whispering at the edge of her thoughts as she pumped water in the morning or banked the fires at night. Was it better to live like the mistress, surrounded by the beautiful, time-honored things of the past, or to embrace the master's world of loud, strange, and efficient machines? She saw no easy answer. The hand-churned butter did taste richer, and the hand-sewn linens were undeniably soft. But the memory of her aching arms and pricked fingers made the allure of a machine undeniable. It was a puzzle she couldn't solve, a quiet tension that seemed to be pulling not just at this one house, but at the entire city rumbling beyond its walls. In the deep quiet of the attic, long after the final bell had rung, Eliza would lie on her straw mattress and listen to the distant sounds of London. In those still moments, she could almost forget the weight of the endless chores and the constant cold that seeped from the stone walls, lost in the wonder of a world caught between two ages. Arthur left the fields behind, trading the scent of damp earth for the sting of coal smoke that caught in the back of his throat with every breath. He had thought he understood what a crowd was from the village market day, but London was something else entirely. It was not a crowd, it was a river of people, and he was a stone thrown into its current, buffeted and turned about with no control. His shoulders constantly brushed against the coarse wool of strangers' coats, and the sheer press of bodies made him feel smaller than he ever had in the wide-open expanse of a freshly plowed field. The noise was a constant assault, a harsh mix of countless iron-shod wheels on stone, vendors shouting about pies and eels, and the murmur of 1,000 conversations in accents he could not place, all blending into a single unending roar that left his ears ringing. This ceaseless motion followed him even to his work on the docks. His strength, once used to guide a plow or scythe a field in long, rhythmic sweeps, was now spent hauling heavy wooden crates from the bellies of ships. The rough wood scraped against his palms, a different kind of callus from the one formed by the smooth handle of his father's tools. He felt a strange disconnect as he moved the cargo. The markings on the boxes spoke of places like India and China, lands he knew only as words from the Bible. He was touching a world far larger than his village, yet he felt more isolated than ever before. Here, his strength was just a commodity, another pair of hands among hundreds, his name unknown to the foreman who barked orders and paid him his wages at the end of the long week. The coins in his pocket felt heavier than any harvest. In a single week, he earned more than his father might see from selling a pig, a tangible proof that his cousin's tales of city wages had been true. Yet the satisfaction was thin and fleeting. Back home, wealth was measured in the fullness of the barn, the health of the livestock, the shared meal at the end of a communal effort. Here, his money bought him a space in a cramped boarding house room he shared with 3 other men, none of whom spoke of anything but their exhaustion. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollowness in his chest that the noise of the city could not fill. He would eat his bread and cheese alone, watching the endless stream of people pass by, each one a stranger with a life he could not begin to imagine. In his village, the rules of life had been as clear and unchanging as the seasons. He knew who to greet, whose path to avoid, and what was expected of him from sunrise to sunset. London's rules were a mystery. He saw women walking alone, their gazes fixed forward, unescorted and seemingly unconcerned, a sight that would have set every tongue in his village wagging for a month. He heard men openly debating politics in public houses, their voices loud and argumentative in a way that would have earned a stern rebuke from the village squire. It felt as though all the familiar structures that held life together had been dissolved, leaving everyone to navigate this chaotic new world on their own, guided by some invisible code he had yet to learn. One Sunday, his day of rest, he found himself following the flow of people westward, drawn by a sense of shared purpose he hadn't felt since his arrival. The crowd grew denser, more refined, the rough work clothes of the docklands giving way to bonnets and smart suits. They were all moving toward Hyde Park, toward a structure that shimmered in the distance. When he finally saw it, he stopped, his breath catching in his chest. It wasn't a building in any way he understood. It was a palace made of glass and air, a colossal greenhouse that seemed to have captured the sunlight itself within its walls. People called it the Crystal Palace, a home for something named the Great Exhibition. He stood before it for what felt like an hour, unable to bring himself to pay the shilling to go inside. It felt like a different world, one not meant for him. He watched the well-dressed families pass through its doors, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The structure seemed impossible, a testament to a power and ingenuity that dwarfed the simple, solid logic of his father's world of stone and timber. It was as if someone had built a dream and placed it in the middle of the city. He could not comprehend the minds that had conceived it, nor the hands that had pieced together its countless panes of glass and delicate iron ribs. It was beautiful, but its beauty was alien and intimidating. He thought of his father, who believed the railway was an offense against God, a machine that moves faster than a man was meant to travel. What would he make of this? A building that held the world's wonders under a single transparent roof? Arthur felt a sudden sharp pang of separation, a sense that he had crossed a divide that he could never uncross. The world of the unchanging fields, of the predictable turning of the seasons, felt impossibly distant, a memory from someone else's life. He had come to the city seeking a better wage, a chance at something new, but he had not understood what he would be leaving behind.
The sheer scale of London had a way of making a person feel anonymous, a single drop of rain in a storm. At the docks, he was simply lad. In the crowded streets, he was an obstacle to be pushed past. Standing before this impossible glass palace, he felt his own insignificance more profoundly than ever. He was a small part of this new age of iron and steam, a cog in a machine whose size and purpose he could barely guess at. He was stronger, richer in coin, and more alone than he had ever been in his life. The path forward was here, in this city of strangers and wonders, but he wondered if he would ever truly find a place to stand. He turned away from the shimmering palace, the murmur of the crowd fading as he walked back toward the grimy, familiar streets of his lodgings. He clutched the coins in his pocket, their cold weight a solid, reassuring presence. They were the reason he was here, the tangible result of his choice. But as he walked, he saw the faces of the people he passed. Tired, determined, hopeful, lost. And he realized they were all like him, pulled from their own fields and villages by the promise of this new world. They were all strangers together, building a new kind of life in the shadow of wonders they had not made, and a future they could not yet see. The work on the docks continued the next day, the routine a comfort in its predictability. The weight of a crate, the strain in his back, the shout of the foreman, these were things he could understand. He learned to read the tides from the old sailors and picked up a few words of greeting from a crew of Irish laborers working beside him. Small connections began to form, thin threads in the vast, overwhelming tapestry of the city. It was not the deep-rooted community of his village, but it was something. It was a start, a way to anchor himself in this churning sea of humanity. He still thought of the fields, especially at dusk, when the sky over the smokestacks turned a soft gray that reminded him of mist rising over the river at home. He would sometimes pause, his hands raw and his body aching, and listen for the sound of a cuckoo or the lowing of cattle, only to hear the rumble of a passing omnibus and the distant shriek of a train whistle. The sounds of his past were being replaced, overwritten by the relentless noise of the present. He wondered if his own children, should he ever have them, would know the silence of a field at dawn, or if their world would only ever be this loud. Each week he set aside a few pennies, a small hoard that grew with painstaking slowness. He did not know what he was saving for exactly. Perhaps it was for a return journey, a retreat to the world he knew. Or perhaps, he thought, as he watched a new iron bridge being constructed over the Thames, it was for a stake in this new world, a chance to build something of his own amidst the chaos. He was torn between the man he had been and the man the city was forcing him to become. The choice was not a single event, but a daily negotiation with his own heart. He never went back to see the Crystal Palace. The memory of it was enough, a bright, unattainable symbol of the age. It existed in his mind as a landmark separating his old life from his new one. The overwhelming, dazzling, and profoundly alienating nature of this new iron and glass world had already woven itself into the fabric of his thoughts, a pattern he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his days. Mr. Finch stood on the new railway platform, a place that still felt alien despite his daily visits. A sharp scent of hot metal and burnt coal stung his nostrils, and he instinctively drew the collar of his coat a little tighter against the fine grit that settled on everything. The ground beneath his feet gave a low, constant hum, a vibration that worked its way up through the soles of his boots and seemed to settle in his bones. Then came the sound, a distant rhythmic chuffing that grew steadily into a deafening roar of hissing steam and the loud clang of steel on steel. The great engine, the iron horse as some called it, pulled into the station, a black behemoth breathing clouds of white vapor that momentarily blotted out the gray sky. It was a daily spectacle, a brute force of nature tamed by iron rails, and it was changing his world. This very machine was the reason his shop was now the talk of the town. Before its arrival, milk was a morning affair, often turning sour by afternoon. Now, great metal churns of fresh, cool milk arrived from the countryside in a matter of hours, allowing him to sell it well into the evening. His shelves, once stocked with whatever local farmers could provide, now boasted chests of tea with markings from London merchants, their contents still fragrant with hints of faraway ports. He could offer his customers oranges in winter and cheeses from counties they had never visited. The train was a river of commerce, and he was positioned perfectly on its bank, drawing from its current to fill his ledger with satisfying, neat columns of black ink. Every hiss of its brakes was the sound of opportunity. This new speed, however, brought with it new pressures that moved just as fast. Yesterday, a boy had run from the station to his shop, handing him a crisp slip of paper. It was a message from his largest supplier in the city, sent along the new telegraph wires. He'd marveled at the device, a strange network of poles and cables that could send words faster than the swiftest horse. But the message itself was a shock. It announced an immediate price increase on flour, effective that very morning. There was no negotiation, no respectful letter sent by post that would give him days to adjust. The message, like the train, was brutally efficient, leaving no room for the old ways of doing business, the handshakes and slow considerations he was used to.
Because of this, Mr. Finch felt a creeping loss of control. He was no longer just the master of his small shop on the corner. He had become a small, replaceable part in a much larger, faster-turning machine. His fortunes were now tied to men in London offices whom he had never met, men who could alter his profits with a few taps of a brass key. The same telegraph that brought him urgent orders could also bring him news of his own undoing. He was working harder than ever, his days longer, his mind constantly calculating and recalculating margins that seemed to shrink with every new delivery. The progress that had so enriched his business was now squeezing it, demanding more from him just to keep his footing. This sense of unease was made worse by the changes he saw in others. Across the street, Mr. Davies, his main competitor, had just finished a loud and dusty expansion, knocking down a wall to double the size of his own grocery. He had installed large plate glass windows, a modern extravagance that made his own small paint shop front look old-fashioned and dim. Davies was borrowing money, taking on debt with a confidence that Mr. Finch found both foolish and terrifying. People whispered that Davies was planning to sell goods at lower prices, buying in such bulk using the railway that he could afford to undercut everyone else. The challenge was clear, written not in a telegraph message, but in brick and mortar. The decision now rested heavily on his shoulders as he stood on the platform. He felt himself torn between two distinct paths. He could continue as he was, a respectable grocer with a loyal customer base, and hope that his quality and service would be enough to weather the storm. This was the safe path, the one that promised quiet nights and a mind free from the terror of debts he couldn't pay. Or he could follow Davies' lead. He could seek a loan from the bank, expand his own premises, and fight fire with fire. This path was filled with risk and uncertainty, but it also held the promise of survival, perhaps even of greater prosperity. It was the path of the new age, an age that seemed to reward the bold and punish the cautious. He thought of his wife, who worried over every shilling, and of his young apprentice, whose future depended on the shop's continued success. To risk their security on a loan felt like a betrayal of his duties as a husband and a master. Yet to do nothing felt like a different kind of failure, a slow surrender to forces he could not stop. He watched the porters hauling crates from the train, their movements quick and practiced. They were part of this new pace, this relentless forward motion. He wondered if he had the strength or the stomach to join them. His own father had run this shop, and his methods had not changed in 40 years. Mr. Finch knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that such a thing was no longer possible. As the train prepared to depart, a final, piercing whistle cut through the station's noise. It felt like a final warning. He watched the massive wheels begin to turn, slowly at first, then gathering speed, pulling the long line of carriages away from the platform until it was just a dark shape disappearing down the track. The machine was a symbol of the future, a future that waited for no one. It promised to carry everyone forward, but it also threatened to leave behind anyone who could not keep up with its relentless pace. He knew he could not simply stand on the platform and watch it go. He turned away from the now quiet tracks and began the walk back to his shop. The scent of coal smoke lingered, a reminder of the power and the pressure that now defined his days. The choice was no longer a distant worry. It was a practical problem that needed a swift answer. The world of predictable seasons and slow-changing prices was gone, replaced by a world of iron, steam, and instantaneous messages that demanded equally instantaneous decisions. His comfortable, familiar world had been irrevocably altered, and he knew he would have to change with it or be swept aside. Later that evening, as Mr. Finch locked the front door of his quiet shop, the distant whistle of the last train heading north sounded through the town. The lonely call was no longer just a sound. It was a question, echoing in the night, asking him what he would do next. For 12 hours, the world was the point of a needle. Mary's fingers, raw at the tips and permanently stained with dye, pushed and pulled, forming a line of tiny, perfect stitches that followed the chalk mark on a piece of thick wool. The only sound in the workshop was the collective whisper of thread passing through fabric, a sound like 100 quiet sighs. Above them, a single gas lamp hissed, casting a yellow, unsteady light that made the eyes water and the headache after a time. She and the other girls sat hunched on low stools, their backs curving into a familiar question mark of fatigue. By day, she was just one pair of hands among many, a small part of a machine made of flesh and thread, her identity lost in the shared labor of the room. This constant work provided the few shillings that helped fill the stew pot at home, a fact her father never failed to mention. After her shift, she would walk back to their tenement room, her movements stiff and her eyes struggling to adjust to the twilight. Their small space always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp laundry. Her father would be sitting by the small fire, his face grim, his silence a heavy blanket over the room. He did not approve of her newest endeavor. "A woman's hands are for work, not for books," he had grumbled when he first found out. "Filling your head with ideas above your station only leads to misery." His words were not shouted in anger, but delivered with a deep, weary certainty that felt far harder to argue against. He believed he was protecting her from a world of disappointment. Because of this, her evenings began with a small deception. After swallowing her portion of thin broth and hard bread, she would wrap her shawl tightly around her shoulders and slip out into the narrow, unlit alleyway. She told her father she was helping a neighbor with her mending, a lie that tasted bitter in her mouth but felt necessary. The journey was short, but it felt like crossing into another country. She navigated by memory, her feet sure on the uneven cobblestones, her mind fixed on her destination. A drafty church basement where a handful of people gathered for the ragged school, a place of learning for those who could afford no other. The air inside was cool and carried the scent of old stone and cheap soap, a welcome change from the workshop. In the dim room, lit by a few donated candles, she took her place on a splintery wooden bench. Here, she was not just a seamstress, she was a scholar. The teacher, a young clerk with a kind face and ink-stained fingers, moved among the students with quiet encouragement. Mary held the piece of slate in her lap, its surface cool and smooth against her worn fingertips. It felt heavier and more important than any piece of fabric she had ever held. With a small piece of chalk, she began to trace the shapes the teacher drew on a large board at the front of the room. At first, they were just lines and curves, meaningless marks that her hand struggled to copy. Her fingers, so nimble with a needle, were clumsy and stiff with the chalk. The effort required was immense, a different kind of labor from her daily toil. Pushing a needle was a task for the body, one that allowed the mind to drift. But this required her complete attention. She had to force her eyes to see the difference between a B and a D, to connect the strange black shapes to the sounds the teacher made. Other students, mostly boys who worked as errand runners or chimney sweeps, whispered and scratched beside her. A shared, quiet determination settled over them all. In this basement, they were not defined by their jobs or their poverty, but by a shared hunger for something more, a hunger that her father could not understand. Gradually, over many nights, the meaningless marks began to arrange themselves into familiar patterns. The scratching on her slate started to look like the words she saw on shop signs or in the penny dreadful newspapers that men read in the public house. One evening, the teacher wrote 3 simple letters on the board: C-A-T. He said the word aloud. Mary looked down at her own shaky copy on the slate, and suddenly a connection sparked in her mind. The shapes were not random. They were a vessel for a sound, for an idea. The feeling was not a dramatic flash of light, but a slow, dawning warmth, a quiet click as a lock opened in her mind.
This small victory felt more profound than a week's wages. It was a secret treasure she carried with her back in the workshop. While her hands stitched endless seams, her mind practiced tracing the shapes of letters, sounding out the names of tools and colors. She found herself caught between 2 worlds. One was her father's world of practical hard work, of obedience and knowing one's place. It was a world of certainty where each day was much like the one before. It was safe, but it was also a cage, its walls built of routine and exhaustion. The other world, the one she found in the cold basement, was uncertain and difficult, but it held a dazzling promise. The teacher eventually loaned her a small, tattered book, a collection of simple fables. She kept it hidden beneath her mattress, bringing it out only late at night when her father was asleep. By the flickering light of a single candle, she would place her finger on a word and whisper it aloud, her voice barely audible. Each sentence she managed to decipher felt like a door opening into a room she never knew existed. The book spoke of talking animals and faraway lands, of ideas and feelings that went far beyond the cramped streets of her neighborhood. It was a world made not of wool and thread, but of imagination. She thought of her father's warning that learning only brings trouble. Perhaps he was right, in a way. The more she learned, the more she felt the constraints of her own life. The endless hours in the workshop felt heavier, the silence in their small room more profound. She was torn between the duty she felt for her family and the new, powerful desire for the life of the mind. It was a quiet, internal battle fought every day. Her hands performed the tasks expected of her, but her thoughts were now traveling to places her feet could never go. The day's stitching had left a familiar ache in her shoulders, but a world built from letters was slowly taking shape in her mind. She traced a word on the cover of the hidden book, feeling the slight indent of the printed letters. This was a different kind of making, not with a needle and thread, but with symbols that held the power to build new thoughts. The choice to continue down this secret path was made not once, but every single evening she slipped out the door,
leaving one world behind to discover another. Years had passed since Eliza first learned the intricate map of household bells, and her hands, though still hard-working, were no longer the raw, chapped hands of a scullery maid. As a senior housemaid, she now carried the keys to the linen press and knew the precise way the mistress preferred her curtains drawn. This world of predictable order, however, had begun to feel fragile as a strange new silence crept into the London streets. The usual morning cries of the watercress seller were gone, and neighbors who once stopped for a moment of gossip now hurried past one another, their faces tight with a shared unspoken dread. A word whispered in the kitchens and market stalls seemed to be the cause of this change: cholera. This fear brought with it a confusing mix of advice and warnings. The mistress, fanning herself in the parlor, declared the sickness a consequence of poor living and weak morals, something that only troubled the crowded, unclean parts of the city. She instructed the staff to burn vinegar in the rooms to purify what she called the unhealthy air, a sharp scent that now clung to the heavy draperies. In contrast, a notice had been pasted to the wall near the public water pump at the end of the street. It was a stark white sheet of paper bearing the Queen's authority, advising all residents to boil their water before drinking it. Many of the neighbors scoffed at this, preferring the cool, familiar taste of water drawn straight from the pump to the flat warmth of boiled water, trusting their own senses over a piece of paper.
Eliza found herself caught between these two worlds of belief. The cook, a woman who trusted in remedies passed down through generations, sided with the mistress about the bad air, hanging bags of camphor around her neck as a personal shield. She muttered darkly about a foul fog that had rolled off the river a week prior, convinced it had brought the sickness with it. Yet Eliza couldn't forget the stark black print on that official notice. She watched from an upstairs window as people continued to gather at the pump, their buckets and jugs clanking, and a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The simple, daily act of fetching water, once a moment for a quick chat, now seemed filled with an invisible threat that no one could agree upon. The threat became terrifyingly real when a sound drifted through the thin wall separating her employer's house from the small dwelling of the cobbler next door. It began as a faint cry, but soon deepened into the unmistakable sounds of a child's painful sickness, followed by the muffled weeping of the mother. The cobbler's daughter, a little girl named Rose with bright red ribbons in her hair, whom Eliza often saw playing on the doorstep, had fallen ill. The mistress immediately forbade any contact. "You are not to go near them," she commanded, her voice sharp. "Their misfortune is not ours to catch. Keep the windows on that side of the house closed." Her words drew a clear, cold line between their comfortable home and the suffering just a few feet away. That night, Eliza lay in her small attic bed, the sounds of grief from the next house a constant, heartbreaking rhythm. She thought of the mistress's orders and the very real danger of losing her position. A housemaid dismissed without a good character reference was ruined, cast out with little hope of finding another place. The fear of that fate was a cold weight inside her. Yet the image of little Rose's cheerful face, now twisted in pain, refused to leave her mind.
to do nothing felt like a betrayal of some deeper, unwritten rule of decency. The choice was a silent one, made in the darkness of her room. She could obey and remain safe, or she could risk everything for a small act of compassion. Slow after the rest of the household was asleep, Eliza slipped out of her bed. Moving with the practiced quiet of a servant, she crept down the back stairs to the kitchen. The embers in the stove still glowed faintly, and by their light she filled a small pot with water from the scullery's cistern and set it to boil, adding a pinch of salt and a spoonful of beef dripping from the larder to make a thin, weak broth. Every sound, the soft bubble of the water, the clink of the spoon against the pot, seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. She poured the hot liquid into a clean jar, wrapped it in a dishcloth to hide its warmth, and unbolted the back door, slipping out into the cool, damp air of the alleyway. The cobbler's door opened before she could knock, as if the mother had been waiting for a miracle. In the dim moonlight, Eliza could see the woman's tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. No words were needed. Eliza pushed the still warm jar into her hands, whispering simply, "It's been boiled, and a little broth for strength." The woman clutched the jar as if it were a treasure, her choked sob of gratitude the only payment Eliza needed. She didn't linger, quickly retreating back into the safety of her own kitchen, her heart pounding with both the thrill of her defiance and a profound sense of rightness. Back in her room, Eliza washed her hands meticulously with the harsh carbolic soap the mistress had recently provided, its chemical smell a strange counterpoint to the lingering sweetness of the night air. She knew her small offering might not be enough. She had heard how swift and unforgiving the sickness could be, and she did not know if the official notice or the old wives' tales held the true answer to fighting it. She had defied her employer, risked her livelihood, and stepped across a line that was meant to keep her safe from the troubles of the world outside her duties. As the first gray light began to touch the soot-stained rooftops, she straightened her cap and smoothed the front of her simple work dress. The familiar textures of the coarse linen felt grounding, a small piece of the ordinary world she knew so well. In the quiet of the dawn, Eliza found a fragile peace in the familiar ritual of preparing for the day's work, a small island of order in a city gripped by an enemy no one could see. The sound reached Arthur first, a steady, insistent thumping that vibrated through the soles of his worn leather boots. It was a rhythm out of place with the usual Saturday afternoon clatter of carts and the calls of street vendors. As he turned the corner onto the main thoroughfare, he saw the source. A procession of people, 4 abreast, marched down the center of the street, their determined pace set by a man hammering a large bass drum strapped to his chest. Banners of painted cloth, held high on wooden poles, bobbed above the sea of bonnets and flat caps. Arthur stopped, his errand to the tobacconist forgotten, and leaned against the cool brick of a draper's shop to watch. The marchers were a mix of men, women, and even children, their faces scrubbed clean and set with a kind of sober purpose that seemed to push back against the city's grime. One of the largest banners, stitched with bold red letters, read, "A pledge for purity, a stand against sin." Another depicted a grim-faced skeleton pouring a dark liquid into the mouth of a weeping man, with the words, "The demon drink claims another soul," painted underneath. Arthur understood their passion well enough. He had seen it himself, week after week, when a good man from the foundry would collect his wages only to leave most of them on the pub counter. He had witnessed the aftermath in the hollow eyes of wives and the threadbare coats of their children. The sight of it always left a bitter taste in his mouth, a grim reminder of how easily a man could lose his footing on the slippery path of life. The marchers sang a hymn, their voices rising together in a hopeful, if slightly uneven chorus that was almost lost beneath the drum's relentless beat.
This procession was the very image of the world his wife Sarah spoke of with such longing. She had asked him again just last Sunday, her hands busy kneading dough, her voice quiet but firm. "Take the pledge, Arthur," she'd said, "for the children, for us." She spoke of the extra shillings they could save, enough for a new pair of boots for their son, or perhaps a small garden plot if they were careful. More than the money, she spoke of respectability, of joining the chapel folk and holding their heads high. He saw the appeal in her words, the promise of a calmer, more orderly existence, free from the anxieties that always seemed to linger around the edges of their life. He imagined a home filled with a quiet peace, a life where his wages went directly from his hand to hers without any detours. On the other hand, the public house was more than just a place to drink. For Arthur, now a foreman at the ironworks, it was a second office, a place where the real work of managing men was done. Over a pint of mild ale, in the haze of pipe smoke and the warmth of the coal fire, he could learn things that were never spoken on the loud, clanging factory floor. He could hear of a wife's sickness, a child's trouble, or a simmering dispute between two furnace men before it boiled over into a fight. It was in the relaxed camaraderie of the Red Lion that he forged the loyalties that made the men listen to his orders the next day. To simply abandon it, to take the pledge and walk past the open door without a glance, felt like a betrayal, not just of a habit, but of the very men who looked to him for leadership. As the parade continued its slow, purposeful journey, he noticed the reactions of the onlookers. A few people on the pavement clapped, their faces bright with approval. A woman in a fine dress nodded from her carriage window. But from the doorways of the pubs that lined the street, there were different responses. Men stood with their arms crossed, their expressions a mixture of amusement and scorn. One shouted something that was swallowed by the sound of the drum, but the laughter that followed told Arthur its meaning. The city itself seemed split in two by the procession. On one side were the marchers with their clean banners and clear-eyed certainty. On the other were the taverns, their windows glowing with a warm, inviting light, promising a brief escape from the hardness of the world. He felt as though he were standing precisely on the line that divided them. The internal debate raged within him, a silent argument that was far louder than the parade. Sarah's vision of a respectable life was a powerful lure.
He wanted that security for her, for their children. He wanted to be the sort of man the Marchers would approve of, steady and dependable. Yet he also knew the value of the community he found in the pub. It was a rough, imperfect world, but it was his world, the one where he had earned his place through strength and fairness. How could he lead his men if he set himself apart from them, judging their simple pleasures from a distance? He worried that taking the pledge would make him a stranger to them, an outsider who no longer understood the pressures they faced and the small comforts they sought. A group of children near the front of the march, dressed in matching blue sashes, began to hand out small printed leaflets to the crowd. A young girl with serious eyes offered one to Arthur. He took it automatically, his calloused fingers fumbling with the thin paper. It was titled "The Drunkard's Path," and it showed a series of crude drawings. The first depicted a happy family outside a cottage. The next showed the husband taking his first drink. Each following picture showed a step further down the road to ruin: poverty, sickness, violence, and finally a lonely grave. It was a simple story, meant to frighten and to warn. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket, the stark images burning in his mind. The end of the procession was now passing him by, the last of the banners dipping as they turned a corner. The sound of the drum began to fade, its beat becoming softer, less demanding, until it was just a faint pulse in the distance. The street slowly returned to its normal state. Carts began to move again, their wheels rumbling over the cobblestones. The everyday sounds of the city rushed back in to fill the silence the marchers had left behind. Arthur remained where he was, leaning against the wall, the folded leaflet a small, sharp rectangle against his chest. He was no closer to a decision than he had been before. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk, not towards the tobacconist, but simply onward, with no destination in mind. His thoughts were a confusing jumble of competing duties. Duty to his family, to their future, to the quiet hope in his wife's eyes. And duty to his men, to the unspoken bonds of shared labor and mutual respect that were nurtured in the very places these marchers condemned. Both felt like solemn responsibilities, and it seemed impossible to honor one without forsaking the other. He could hear the faint echo of the temperance hymn in one ear, and the imagined sound of laughter and clinking glasses from the Red Lion in the other. He found himself standing on a bridge, looking down at the slow, murky water of the canal below. Barges laden with coal drifted past, guided by men whose faces were permanently smudged with black dust. They lived a hard life, and he knew that for many of them, the pub at the end of the day was the only brightness they could count on. Was it his place to judge that? Or was it his place to show them a better way, as Sarah believed? The question had no easy answer. It was a weight he carried alone, a choice that seemed to define not just what he would do, but who he would be. The city hummed around him, a great machine of industry and human struggle. He thought of his father in the quiet fields, a life with clear and simple rules governed by the seasons. Here, the rules were made by men, and they were constantly changing, constantly in conflict. The clash of loyalties that pulled at Arthur, with its competing calls for respectability and camaraderie, felt both deeply personal and part of the very fabric of the world he now inhabited. The heavy oak of the council table felt cool and solid beneath Mr. Finch's palms. Years of diligent work, of weighing sugar and stacking tins, had led him here to a seat among men whose hands had never dusty with flour. He adjusted the stiff collar that dug into his neck, a constant reminder of his new station. The room itself was a world away from his shop. Its dark wood panels drank the light, and the air was still, carrying only the faint scent of beeswax and old paper. On the table before them all lay the reason for their gathering, a crisp document from London outlining what was being called the Public Health Act. The words felt momentous, a declaration that the health of a town was now the business of its leaders. As the chairman began to speak, Mr. Finch's mind drifted back not years, but decades. He was a boy again, and the memory wasn't of a document, but of a smell. The foul odor that clung to the riverbank in the summer months. He recalled the hushed whispers about cholera, a word that carried more fear than any ghost story. People had blamed the unhealthy air rising from the nearby tanneries, or the damp fog that settled in the low-lying streets. They simply accepted it as a part of life, a grim lottery where a neighbor could be healthy one day and gone the next. The memory made him press his fingers harder into the unyielding wood of the table, a tangible anchor in the present. That past suffering gave the papers in front of him a profound significance. An engineer had been consulted, and his drawings showed a complex web of brick tunnels and clay pipes, a hidden system designed to carry waste far from the town's wells and homes. Mr. Finch traced one of the lines with his eyes, marveling at the sheer ambition of it. It was a promise of a future where children wouldn't have to play near open drains, where the water from the pump was a source of life, not a fear. This plan was a weapon against the unseen enemy he remembered so clearly, a fight waged not with soldiers, but with bricks and mortar, a battle for the very ground beneath their feet. However, this battle had its dissenters. Mr. Davies, whose textile mill employed half the men in the district, cleared his throat loudly. "The cost," he began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed, "is frankly staggering. We are businessmen, not dreamers. My grandfather built his business in this town, and he did so without these subterranean extravagances. Things have always been this way, and we have prospered." Several other men around the table nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a shared anxiety over the proposed tax increase that would be required to fund such a project. To them, the drawings represented not progress, but a direct threat to their profits. A familiar tension tightened in Mr. Finch's chest, the same feeling he used to get when a large shipment was late and his shelves were growing bare. He pushed his chair back slightly and stood, a deliberate movement that drew every eye. He had learned that in this room, a grocer's opinion had to be delivered with the weight of a judge. "Mr. Davies speaks of prosperity," Mr. Finch began, his voice even and calm. "But I ask you, what is the value of a workforce that is halved by fever every decade? I remember the cholera. I remember the fear. We were not prospering then. We were surviving. We are not fighting a disease with this plan, gentlemen. We are fighting an old and dangerous attitude. The belief that what has always been is what must always be. His words hung in the still air, and he could see he had unsettled them. To support his argument, he turned a page on the engineer's report. He suggests pipes of a particular shape, Mr. Finch continued, pointing to a cross-section diagram. An oval, like an egg standing on its end. A curious design, but one that ensures the water flows swiftly, cleaning the pipes as it goes. A landowner from the west end of town, a man named Prendergast, let out a short, dismissive laugh. Egg-shaped pipes? Are we building a sewer or a hen house? Think of the disruption. My tenants will have their streets dug up for months on end. It's a ridiculous expense and an even more ridiculous inconvenience. Mr. Finch met his gaze directly, refusing to be flustered by the man's attempt to make the project sound foolish. He had spent his life understanding costs and benefits, and he now applied that same simple logic to this far grander scale. The inconvenience of digging a trench is temporary, he countered, his voice sharp with conviction. It is a fraction of the cost, in both coin and in grief, of a single funeral for a child lost to typhoid. A small investment now in bricks and clay will save us from paying a much higher price later. Surely we can all agree that healthy workers and healthy customers are the bedrock of a truly prosperous town. This is not an expense. It is the most important investment we will ever make. The room descended into a low murmur of divided opinions. Some men leaned forward, studying the plans with a new seriousness, while others shook their heads and whispered to their neighbors. Mr. Finch felt he was not just arguing about a sewer system, but about two different visions of the future. One was a future built on caution and tradition, clinging to the familiar ways that had served men like Davies and Prendergast so well. The other was a future built on foresight and science, one that required sacrifice in the present for the promise of a safer, cleaner tomorrow. He saw now that progress was not a gentle tide that lifted everyone equally. It was a hard-fought battle, won inch by inch, in rooms just like this one. Finally, the chairman rapped his gavel on the table, the sharp sound cutting through the arguments. "It is clear," the chairman announced, "that we are not of one mind on this matter. We shall postpone the vote. I suggest you all study the engineer's proposal and the costings in greater detail." It was not the victory Mr. Finch had hoped for, but it was not a complete defeat either. He had forced them to look, to truly consider the consequences of inaction. As the men gathered their papers, some offered him a curt nod, while others, like Mr. Davies, avoided his eyes entirely. He knew he had strained relationships that had taken years to build. Leaving the stale air of the council chamber behind, Mr. Finch stepped out into the late afternoon. The familiar streets of his town looked different to him now. He saw the world through the lens of the engineer's drawings, noticing every open gutter, every puddle of standing water, not as a simple fact of life, but as a flaw in a system that could be fixed.
He smelled the coal smoke and the riverbank, not with resignation, but with a new sense of purpose. The fight was just beginning, and he knew it would be long and tiresome, pitting neighbor against neighbor and progress against profit. In the fading light of the day, Mr. Finch carried the weight of the council's arguments with him. The intricate web of pipes on the engineer's map was imprinted on his mind, a blueprint for a future that was not yet guaranteed, a battle that was still far from won. Before she learned to read or write, Mary learned the landscape of smells that made up her world. There was the sharp, clean scent of the lye soap her mother used on wash days, the comforting aroma of baking bread from the shop down the lane, and the ever-present undertone of coal smoke that clung to every curtain and coat. But the summer of her 17th year brought a new smell, an invader that pushed all others aside. It was a foulness that crept in through the cracks around the window frames, a sour, heavy presence that made her stomach clench and her throat feel perpetually raw. It was the river, or rather, what the river had become. People had started calling it the Great Stink, giving a name to the misery that had settled over London.
This oppressive odor changed the rhythm of life. Windows that were once thrown open to catch a summer breeze were now nailed shut, and people walked the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. It was on one such afternoon, when breathing itself felt like a chore, that John, the young carpenter she was courting, came to call. He did not knock, but called her name softly from the bottom of the tenement stairs, his voice a welcome sound in the stifling quiet of the building. When she met him, he was holding not a flower, but a small cloth sprinkled with lavender water. He offered it to her with a shy smile, a simple gesture of care that felt more precious than any bouquet. He suggested a walk, not along the river as they sometimes did, but somewhere else, somewhere they might find cleaner air to breathe. Their journey to find that clean air took them away from the narrow, choked streets of their neighborhood and toward the west. Every step was a negotiation with the pervasive smell. They saw draymen urging their horses on, their faces grim, and well-dressed women in covered chairs carried by servants who held scented pomanders to their noses, their expressions pinched with distaste. John walked close to Mary, a steadying presence in the unsettling landscape. He spoke of his work, of the sweet smell of freshly sawn pine in the workshop, a scent he missed now that it was overwhelmed by the river's decay. His words painted a picture of a different world, one of clean lines and natural things, and for a few moments, Mary could almost forget the foulness that made her eyes water. Finally, they reached the gates of one of the city's new public parks. Passing through them was like stepping into another country. The scent of roses and freshly cut grass met them, a clean and wholesome wave that made Mary take her first deep, clear breath of the day. The sensation was so relieving it almost made her dizzy. Here, the world was orderly and green. Families sat on blankets spread across the grass, and children chased hoops along manicured gravel paths. The harsh mix of city sounds was replaced by the chirping of sparrows and the gentle rustle of leaves in the tall elm trees. It was a carefully constructed piece, a sanctuary built of lawns and flower beds, and it felt like a miracle. They found a bench beneath a broad oak tree, the wood warmed by the afternoon sun. Here they could sit without needing the lavender-scented cloth, and they could speak in normal tones instead of through layers of fabric. It was in this clean, quiet space that their conversations about the future truly began to take shape. John spoke of his ambition to one day be a master carpenter, to have his own shop and build furniture that was sturdy and honest. He described the home he dreamed of building, one with large windows to let in the light and a small garden in the back. His dream was not of wealth or status, but of simple, clean self-sufficiency. Listening to him, Mary found her own hopes clarifying. The experience of the foul summer had planted in her a deep yearning for cleanliness and order. A home, she thought, should be a place of refuge, not a trap where one hid from the unhealthy air outside. She imagined a kitchen with a scrubbed wooden table and the smell of baking, not the inescapable odor of the river. Their shared dream was forged in that park, a vision born directly from the environmental crisis they were living through. Their courtship was no longer just about personal affection. It became a quiet pact to build a life that was fundamentally healthier and cleaner than the one they knew. This desire for a different kind of life shaped all their subsequent meetings that summer. The park became their regular destination, their private world where they could breathe and dream. They learned the names of the different flowers in the meticulously planted beds and watched the swans glide across the pond. The contrast between the park's deliberate beauty and the city's accidental filth was a constant, unspoken presence. It reinforced their shared values and made their bond stronger. The city's failure to manage its own waste had, in a strange way, given their relationship a powerful shared purpose: to create a small, clean corner for themselves in a dirty world. One evening, as they walked back from the park, the difference was especially jarring. They left behind the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine and walked back into the wall of the city's stench. The setting sun cast a strange, yellowish light over the rooftops, and the familiar smell seemed to have grown stronger in the cooling air. John held her hand a little tighter, a silent acknowledgement of their return to the reality they had to endure. He walked her all the way to her door, and before he left, he promised he would bring her a small sachet of dried lavender from the market, something to keep by her bed to ward off the worst of the smell at night. That small promise felt enormous. It was an act of practical care, a defense against the unseen enemy that surrounded them. Back in her small room, Mary pressed the handkerchief he had given her to her face, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of lavender that still lingered. It was a tiny rebellion against the oppressive foulness that seeped through the walls. She looked out her sealed window at the hazy twilight, at the city that was both her home and her trial. The summer of the Great Stink was a time of misery for many, a crisis that brought sickness and despair. But for her and John, it was the summer that had clarified everything, turning a simple courtship into a shared dream of a better, cleaner future. This crisis was shaping more than just courtships. It was forcing a change upon the entire city. Mary would overhear men at the market talking in low, angry tones about Parliament and the need for new sewers. The newspapers, which she was slowly learning to read, were filled with articles demanding action. The very air people breathed had become a matter of public debate and political urgency. It was a strange thought that the foulness that made her stomach turn was also being discussed by important men in grand buildings just a few miles away. The problem was too big to ignore any longer. It had crept into every home, rich and poor, a great leveler that respected no social standing. Yet, for Mary, the issue remained deeply personal. It was the stinging in her nose when she woke, the fear of sickness that was a constant companion, and the profound relief of escaping to the green sanctuary of the park. That evening, she thought not of the grand plans for new tunnels and pipes, but of the feel of John's hand in hers and the scent of roses in the clean air. Their personal dream felt more real and attainable than any act of Parliament. It was a small, fragile hope they nurtured together, a plan to build a life where they would not have to flee their own home just to be able to breathe. Mary carefully folded the lavender-scented cloth and placed it on her small bedside table, a tangible reminder of the day. Tomorrow would bring the same heavy odor, but it would also bring the hope of another walk, another hour of clean air and quiet conversation. The vibration was the first thing Thomas noticed, as it had been every day of his life. It was a deep, unending tremor that lived in the flagstones of the street, traveled up through the soles of his worn leather boots, and settled in his bones. He had first felt it as a boy, a constant companion, to the roar of the looms he had once darted beneath. Now, as a man with graying temples and hands permanently shaped to the tools of his trade, the feeling was no different. Yet something had shifted in the air of the mill yard. A crowd of men and a few women stood clustered around the main gate, their usual end-of-day chatter replaced by a low, anxious murmur. Thomas edged his way through the bodies, the familiar smell of sweat, coal smoke, and damp wool filling his lungs with each push, until he could see the source of the commotion, a stark white notice pasted fresh upon the grim brickwork. The foreman stood beside it, arms crossed, his face set in a look of grim neutrality. "It's the law, not my doing," he repeated to anyone who challenged him. "From next Monday, no child under 10 years of age sets foot on this floor. Any lad older, up to 13, is on half-time. Mornings here, afternoons at the schoolhouse. No exceptions." Thomas felt a strange knot tighten in his stomach, a feeling that was equal parts soaring relief and sickening dread. He thought of his own son, James, who was 9. He remembered his own childhood, a blur of aching limbs and cotton fluff that made his chest burn, a youth sacrificed to the relentless hunger of the machines. He wanted better for James, a life beyond this constant, draining vibration. But the thought was immediately followed by a cold, practical calculation. James's small wage, those few precious shillings a week, were the difference between a pot with a bit of meat and a pot with nothing but thin broth. This new reality followed him home, shadowing his steps,
through the narrow, cobbled streets where the evening meal was being cooked in 100 identical houses. The scent of frying onions from one doorway mixed with the sharp smell of lye soap from another. Inside his own small kitchen, his wife Sarah looked up from the hearth, her face already etched with the same worry he felt. "You've heard, then?" she asked, her voice quiet. He nodded, sinking onto a wooden stool that groaned under his weight. On the small table, James sat with a tattered book, a gift from a church charity. His small brow was furrowed in concentration as he traced a finger under a line of dense black letters, his lips moving silently. A part of Thomas's heart swelled with a fierce pride. The boy was bright. But another part, the part that knew the precise cost of a loaf of bread, saw only the empty space at the mill bench where his son should have been. The law, meant to be a kindness from the great men in London, had split their street down the middle. Later that evening, a knock came at their door. It was his neighbor, Bill, a fellow weaver whose eldest daughter was 11. "It's a fool's game, Thomas," Bill said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper as he stood on the doorstep, refusing to come in. "Pay for schooling? They'll teach the lad just enough to be unhappy with his station. I told the foreman my girl was 14 come Michaelmas. What's a few years on paper?" He winked, a gesture that felt both friendly and deeply unsettling. "You should do the same for your James. A strong lad like him is worth more on the factory floor than with his nose in a book." Thomas thanked him quietly and shut the door, the simple logic of his neighbor's argument ringing with a terrible clarity. It was the old way of thinking, the one that had kept them all fed, if not free. That night, the house felt smaller, the silence more pronounced. James, tired of his book, had fallen asleep by the dwindling fire, his small chest rising and falling in the faint orange glow. Sarah sat opposite Thomas, her hands busy mending a tear in James's trousers, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. "What Bill said, it makes a kind of sense," she murmured, not looking up from her work. "We could say James is 10. Who would check? The foreman wants bodies at the looms." Thomas looked at his sleeping son, at the smudge of dirt on his cheek that even a hard scrubbing couldn't quite remove. He imagined the boy's hands, now soft, becoming calloused and stained with machine oil like his own. He remembered the feeling of being small and invisible in a world of giant, thundering machines, a feeling he had sworn his own child would never know. The conflict churned within him, a bitter mix of love and necessity. He saw two paths laid out for his son, each demanding a different kind of sacrifice. One path led back to the mill gate, to the familiar rhythm of work and wages, a life of certainty, however bleak. It was the world he knew, the world his father had known. The other path led to the schoolhouse, a quiet, unknown place that promised what? The ability to read a newspaper? To write his own name without shame? It was a future as abstract and distant as the clouds. Yet, the thought of it held a fragile, powerful hope.
He wondered if this new law was truly a gift from a more caring government, or if it was just another, cleverer way for the masters to shape their children into more useful, more obedient workers for the factories of the future. He reached out and picked up the book James had been reading. It was a simple collection of stories, the paper rough and cheap beneath his fingertips. He opened it to the page the boy had marked. The words were a jumble of shapes he could only partially recognize. He'd had no schooling himself, only the harsh education of the factory floor. He saw his own life reflected in those unreadable lines. A story he could not write, a world he could not fully enter. Was he to condemn his son to the same fate, all for the sake of a few extra shillings to see them through the winter? The weight of the decision felt heavier than any bale of cotton he had ever lifted. It was a choice between the hunger in their bellies today and the potential hunger in their son's mind for all his tomorrows. The next morning, the factory whistle shrieked, its call echoing off the damp slate roofs. It was the sound that had ruled his life, a summons he had never been able to ignore. But today, he heard it differently. He watched James pull on his boots, his small face serious. The boy looked up at him, his eyes full of a silent question. "Will I be going with you, Da?" Thomas looked from his son's hopeful face to the meager contents of their larder. He felt the pull of generations of hard, unquestioning labor, the instinct to provide, to survive. Yet, seeing the book still sitting on the table, a small portal to another world, he felt a different instinct rise within him, a desire not just to endure, but to build. "No, lad," Thomas said, his voice rough but steady. "Not today. Today you'll be learning your letters." A slow, bright smile spread across James's face, a sight more valuable than any wage. Thomas knew the coming months would be hard. He knew his neighbor, Bill, would call him a fool, and he knew the gnawing anxiety of an empty purse would be his constant companion. He would have to find extra shifts, and Sarah would have to take in more mending. The path they had chosen was steeper and harder, its destination uncertain. It was a gamble, a bet placed on a future he could only imagine, a wager against the unyielding logic of the machine. He walked to the mill alone, the space beside him where his son might have walked, feeling vast and empty. As he joined the stream of workers flowing through the gates, he saw other men with their sons, some heading toward the looms, others directing their boys toward the newly whitewashed schoolhouse on the next street over. The community was a fractured thing this morning, families making their own silent, difficult choices, their decisions creating invisible lines between them. Some chose the certainty of the present, others the possibility of the future. Thomas didn't know if he had made the right choice, only that he had made one. He took his place at his loom, the familiar clatter and roar enveloping him once more. The great leather belts overhead slapped and whirred, and the floor began its endless, rhythmic dance beneath his feet. He surrendered to the motion, his hands moving with the practiced ease of long years, tying and mending threads in a blur of automatic skill. Yet his mind was elsewhere, in a quiet room filled with the scratch of pencils on slate and the sound of a young voice learning to shape the world into words. Throughout the sprawling, smoke-stained city, the clamor of industry continued its powerful, unceasing beat, a sound that had always defined their lives, but which now held the faint, new echo of a competing rhythm. The quiet ticking of the mantelpiece clock was a sound Eliza had come to associate with peace. In the years since her husband's passing, she had found a gentle rhythm living here, in her daughter Clara's home. The parlor was always warm, a pleasant sensation against her aged skin, and the scent of beeswax from the polished furniture was a constant comfort. As a widow, her life had settled into predictable pattern of helping with the grandchildren and keeping her own small room in order, a world away from the great houses where she had once served. She held a porcelain teacup, its smooth, cool surface a familiar anchor in her worn hands, and watched her daughter speak with two friends who had come for the afternoon. Their conversation, however, was anything but peaceful. The words they used were sharp and strange, full of a new kind of energy that seemed to crackle in the cozy room. Words like suffrage, meaning the right for women to vote, and emancipation, a term Eliza had only ever heard applied to faraway slaves. Her daughter, Clara, spoke with a fervor that made her teacup rattle in its saucer. She and her friends discussed pamphlets they were writing and meetings they planned to attend, their voices low but intense. To Eliza, who had spent a lifetime learning the intricate rules of a world defined by duty and deference, a world where a woman's influence was meant to be quiet, felt but not heard, their talk felt like a foreign language. It was both thrilling and deeply unsettling, like watching someone try to rearrange the very furniture of the world. This new way of thinking was a stark contrast to the life she had known. Her own existence had been governed by the needs of others, a landscape of unspoken rules where success was measured in invisibility and silence. She remembered the endless stone floors to be scrubbed, the heavy pots to be scoured, and the delicate art of navigating a household's unseen currents of power. A woman's place was a fixed point, a carefully guarded territory with clear boundaries. Defiance was a small, secret thing, a kindness offered against orders, a shared glance of understanding with another maid. It was never this open, organized challenge to the way things were, spoken aloud in a respectable parlor over afternoon tea. The parlor door opened, and her son-in-law, Robert, entered, bringing with him a gust of cool air and a sterner atmosphere. He was a good man, a solicitor who provided well for Clara, but his face darkened as he caught the tail end of the women's conversation. He dismissed their ideas with a wave of his hand, calling it unwomanly nonsense that would only bring ridicule upon the family. He spoke of the natural order of things, of the different spheres for men and women, his voice calm but unyielding. His words hung in the air, a heavy counterpoint to the women's passionate whispers. Eliza watched Clara's jaw tighten, a familiar sign of her daughter's stubborn spirit, a spirit Eliza both admired and feared for. Clara did not back down. Instead, she met her husband's gaze and spoke of fairness, of having a voice in the laws that governed her life and the future of her children. Her friends murmured their agreement, their solidarity a quiet force in the room. Eliza looked at her daughter's face, flushed with conviction, and saw a fire she recognized but had never allowed herself to tend. It was the same spark that had led Eliza, decades ago, to secretly bring boiled water to a sick neighbor during the cholera scare, defying her mistress's callous indifference. Her own acts of rebellion had been small, hidden, and born of compassion for one person. This was different. This was a rebellion of ideas, fought with words and pamphlets for the sake of countless women she would never meet. The conversation grew more heated, a clash of two worlds happening right before her. Robert argued that politics was a dirty business, unfit for the purer sensibilities of women, and that their involvement would disrupt the sanctity of the home. Clara's friends countered, speaking of women in factories and mills whose lives were directly shaped by political decisions made by men who knew nothing of their struggles. They talked of new laws, of petitions to Parliament, of building a movement brick by brick. Eliza found herself leaning forward, catching fragments of plans and arguments. She felt a strange pull, a sense of witnessing the start of something immense and powerful, even if she could not fully grasp its shape. After a tense silence, Robert left the room, his disapproval a tangible presence left behind. The two friends soon departed as well, leaving Eliza and Clara alone in the fading afternoon light. The hiss of the gaslight on the wall became more noticeable in the quiet. Clara sat staring into the fire, her earlier passion now replaced by a look of weary determination. She seemed so much older in that moment, burdened by the weight of the future she was trying to build. Eliza thought of all the things she had accepted in her life without question, the countless times she had lowered her eyes and quieted her tongue because that was what was expected. She reached across the small table that separated them and placed her hand over her daughter's. Clara looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears of frustration and hope. Eliza gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent message that needed no new or radical words to be understood. It was an acknowledgement of her daughter's fire, a quiet vote of confidence from a woman of the old world to a woman fighting to create a new one. It was not a pledge to march or sign a petition, but it was a bridge thrown across a generational divide, a recognition that the world was indeed changing. The steady hiss of the gaslight filled the ensuing silence as Eliza considered all that had been said. The world she had known, with its rigid certainties and quiet duties, felt as if it were slowly dissolving, replaced by a future of loud questions and uncertain answers, a future being forged in conversations just like this, in parlors all across the city. The fine, pale curls of pine fell from the blade of the spokeshave, landing softly on the already thick carpet of shavings at Silas's feet. Each pass of the tool was a whisper, a familiar sound that had been the backdrop of his life for more than 60 years. He didn't need to measure with his eyes anymore. His hands knew the precise curve of the chair leg he was shaping. The muscles in his forearms, corded and roped even in his old age, remembered the exact pressure needed to coax the shape from the raw block of wood. The workshop was a small space, filled with the sweet, clean scent of pine resin and the deeper, nutty fragrance of linseed oil. Light from the single wide window caught the golden tones of the wood, making the fresh shavings glow. This light was his clock, its slow journey across the floor marking the passage of his day more reliably than any timepiece. This steady rhythm was broken by a sharp rap on the door, followed by its immediate opening. His grandson Arthur stood on the threshold, bringing with him a gust of city air that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. The boy, though he was a man of 20 now, seemed to fill the small space with a restless energy that did not belong amongst the patient, waiting tools. He worked in one of the new, vast furniture factories over in the East End, a place of steam-powered saws and deafening noise, and he always seemed to carry the echo of that noise with him. Arthur stomped his boots on the threshold, dislodging city grime. He smiled, but his eyes were already scanning the workshop, not with appreciation, but with a kind of impatient curiosity, as if it were a room in a museum.
Arthur picked up a finished dovetail joint from the workbench, a perfect intersection of two pieces of oak, so seamless it looked as if it had grown that way. "Still making them like this, Grandad? Takes you a whole morning for one corner, doesn't it?" His voice was affectionate, but it held a note of friendly pity that pricked at Silas's quiet pride. Silas paused his work, running a thumb over the smooth wood of the chair leg. He thought of how to explain the feeling of the wood fibers yielding just so, the satisfaction of a joint sliding home with a snug sigh that needed no glue, no nails, just perfect geometry. It was a language he had spent a lifetime learning, but he had no words for it that Arthur would understand. Instead, he simply nodded. "A thing must be made right, or it is not worth making," he said, the words worn as smooth as his oldest chisel handle. Arthur set the joint down and began to pace the narrow channel between the workbench and the stacks of lumber. He spoke of his own work, his words tumbling out in a rush, full of figures and speed. "We turned out 200 kitchen chairs yesterday. 200! The new steam press can stamp out a decorated back panel in 5 seconds. 5 seconds, Grandad! Mr. Harris is bringing in a machine from America that cuts mortises automatically. No more tapping away with a mallet for hours." He spoke of it all as a great victory, a triumph of ingenuity over the slow, stubborn resistance of wood. Silas listened, his hands resting on his unfinished chair leg. He tried to picture it. 200 chairs, all identical, their parts cut not by a knowing hand, but by an unthinking machine. He wondered if they felt right to the touch, if their joints would hold for 100 years as his would. The boy spoke of standardized parts, of pieces that were interchangeable from one chair to the next. The very idea felt alien to Silas. Each piece of wood he worked with was different. One had a knot that needed to be accommodated, another a grain that suggested a certain curve.
The wood itself was a partner in the work. It had a say in the final product. He couldn't imagine forcing it into a shape it was not meant to hold. This disconnect between their worlds was a chasm that seemed to widen with every visit. To Arthur, wood was a raw material to be conquered and processed as quickly as possible. To Silas, it was a living thing to be understood and persuaded. The boy saw time as an enemy, something to be beaten by the pace of a steam engine. For Silas, time was the most essential tool in his workshop. It was the agent that seasoned the timber, that allowed the oil to cure, that gave his hands the patience to do the job properly. He felt no bitterness toward his grandson, only a quiet, deep-seated melancholy. He was looking at the future, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that there was no room for him in it. Arthur, oblivious to the old man's thoughts, continued his tour of the small shop. "You know," he said, gesturing to the rows of hand planes, each one specifically shaped for a different task, "we have one machine that does all of this. One blade, set at the right depth, and a plank comes out smooth as glass in one pass." He meant it to be impressive, a report from a wondrous new world. But to Silas, it sounded like a description of a barren land. He thought of the unique rasp of each plane, the sound it made as it bit into the wood, the different feel of it in his hands. Losing that variety felt like losing a conversation, like being forced to speak in only one tone of voice. "But does it read the grain?" Silas asked, his voice soft. "Does it know when to cut deep and when to skate lightly over a difficult patch?" Arthur just shrugged, a gesture that dismissed 60 years of accumulated knowledge. "It doesn't need to. The steam engine provides so much power, it just pushes right through. Doesn't matter what the grain is doing." This, for Silas, was the heart of the matter. The new world wasn't working with the wood. It was simply overpowering it. It was a world of force, not feel. He worried for his grandson, who was learning a trade without ever truly learning the material at its heart. He was learning to operate a machine, not to craft a chair. The visit soon wound down. Arthur looked at the clock on the church tower visible through the window, the need for schedules and timed appointments pulling at him. He promised to visit again soon, clapping his grandfather on the shoulder with a brisk, modern affection. The touch was jarring after the quiet solitude. As the door closed, the smells of the city were once again sealed out, and the familiar scent of pine and oil reclaimed the space. Silas stood motionless for a long moment, listening to his grandson's quick footsteps fade down the cobbled alley. He was not just a relic. His entire world was becoming one. He picked up the spokeshave again, its wooden handles fitting perfectly into the palms of his hands. It was a tool his own father had used, its surface worn smooth by 2 generations of labor. He brought the blade to the chair leg, and with the first gentle pull, another perfect, fragrant curl of wood fell to the floor. The sound was a comfort, a reassurance that in this small room at least, the old ways still held. He tried to remember if he'd ever felt the same impatience as Arthur when he was young, the same eagerness for the future. He supposed he must have, but the future he had imagined was one of more workshops like his, not fewer. He knew his grandson saw his life as small and limited, a cycle of repetitive tasks performed in a dusty room. Yet, from inside that life, it felt vast. Every piece of furniture he created was a new journey, a new set of problems to be solved, a new relationship with a particular piece of timber. He had made chairs for weddings, cradles for newborns, and sturdy tables that had witnessed generations of family meals. His work was woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, into the lives of the people who lived there. Arthur's 200 identical chairs, sold to strangers through a catalog, could never know that kind of connection. In the quiet that followed his grandson's departure, as the afternoon light began to soften and turn to gold, Silas planed the wood with a steady, unhurried motion. He could feel the slightest tremor in his hands now, a hint of the weakness that age was bringing. He wondered who would use these tools when he was gone. Who would know how to sharpen the saws just so, or how to read the whispers in the grain? In these moments, lost in the familiar rhythm of his work, he could almost forget the roar of the factories and the encroaching silence that awaited his craft. Mr. Finch stood before the great glass windows of his department store, his hands clasped behind his back, feeling the familiar heft of his gold watch chain. The street before him was a river of motion and noise. An electric tram, all bright paint and polished brass, sent a sharp clang through the air as it rattled past on its metal tracks, its overhead wire hissing faintly. He watched it go, his gaze following the hurried movements of men in bowler hats and women whose fashionable sleeves were puffed so wide they had to turn sideways to pass one another on the crowded pavement. He remembered a different kind of noise, a different kind of street. The memory came to him not as a picture, but as a smell. The warm, slightly greasy scent of tallow candles and the sharp tan of vinegar from a pickle barrel. That was the first scent of his ambition, in a small shop with sawdust on the floor and a single bell that tinkled whenever a customer pushed open the door. In those early days, light itself had been a commodity he sold by the stick and measured by the hour. He recalled the effort of trimming wicks in the evening, his fingers stained with soot, to create a pool of wavering yellow light just bright enough to count the day's coins. Then came the gas lamps, installed with a fuss of pipes and workmen who left plaster dust on his neatly stacked tins of tea. He remembered the first time the gas man lit the mantle, the soft pop, and the sudden, steady white glare that felt like a miracle. It pushed the shadows into the farthest corners of the shop, making everything seem cleaner, newer. People stayed out later, their faces pale under the street lamps, and his shop could stay open longer. The change was not just in the light, but in the very rhythm of the day, which now stretched further into the night. This new brightness was soon matched by a new speed that arrived on the streets outside. For years, the dominant sound had been the steady, unhurried clopping of hooves on cobblestones and the rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels. He had known the delivery draymen by name, their horses patient animals who would wait with a soft snort for a lump of sugar. The first horse-drawn trams were an improvement, a shared ride for a penny, but they moved at the pace of a brisk walk. He remembered the shift when the electric trams arrived, feeling the vibration through the floor of his expanding store. They moved with an unnerving swiftness, their bells a constant, demanding clang that cut through the air. The patient horses were replaced by a powerful, invisible force, and the city itself seemed to quicken its pulse, demanding that everyone keep up. His own business had to keep pace with this relentless change. He started by adding a second room, then a third, absorbing the little tailor shop next door. Where once he sold only flour, sugar, and tea, he began to stock items that would have seemed like unimaginable luxuries in his youth. He brought in ready-made dresses, rows of them stitched by machines in factories, a world away from the single lamp under which a seamstress like Mary might have once labored. He installed a pneumatic tube system, a network of brass pipes that whisked cash and receipts between departments with a startling thump and a puff of air. Each addition, from the plate glass windows to the ornate iron lift that carried customers between floors, was a step away from the simple shop he had started, a testament to his knack for understanding what people wanted before they knew it themselves. With his growing wealth came invitations to rooms he had only ever imagined. He learned to navigate dinners in grand houses, where the silverware felt foreign in his hands, and the conversation drifted toward art and politics in a way that made him feel slow-witted. He would listen to men born to their fortunes speak of their family estates, their words effortless and assured, and he would feel the rough grain of his own beginnings. On one occasion, he overheard a man in another room refer to him with a thin smile as "our industrious grocer," and the words, meant as a compliment, felt like a carefully polished stone wall he could never climb. He had earned his place at their table, but he would never truly belong to their world. He could buy the same suit, drink the same wine, but he could not purchase a different past. Now, in the final year of the Queen's long reign, he watched the descendants of that past walk by his window. He saw young men, their shoulders squared with the confidence of foremen and clerks who had never known the uncertainty of the fields. He saw young women carrying books, their expressions full of a purpose that would have been unthinkable for the maids of Eliza's generation. They were all customers now, their lives interwoven with the world of commerce he had helped build. They bought the soap that promised cleanliness, the tea that offered comfort, and the factory-made boots that carried them through the bustling city. They were the children and grandchildren of the silent revolution, a people shaped by the relentless hum of machines and the promise of a wage paid in coin. He felt the weight of the years not in his bones, but in the sheer distance between the candle-lit counter of his memory and the brilliant electric glow that now illuminated his name above the door. He had climbed higher than he had ever dreamed, building a small kingdom of goods and commerce on a single street corner. He had provided for his family, earned the respect of the town council, and created work for hundreds. Yet, standing there, he understood the quiet truth of his life. He was a builder in an age of builders, a man who had seized the opportunities offered by steam and steel. He had achieved a profound success, but there was a ceiling, unseen but solid, that had been built into the very foundations of the world he inhabited. A young boy, no older than 10, pressed his face against the glass,
his eyes wide at a display of clockwork toys. He was clean and well-fed, the son of a clerk or a skilled worker, a world away from the grime-faced children who once darted under the looms of the great mills. Mr. Finch watched him, a flicker of something he could not name passing through him, not regret, but a deep, quiet understanding. He had not changed the world, but he had stocked its shelves. He had not broken down the old walls of class, but he had built a very comfortable room for himself on his side of them.
He turned from the window, the clanging of the passing tram fading as he walked deeper into his store. The air inside was calm, smelling faintly of new cloth and floor polish. He was an old man now, a relic from a time of candles and horses. Yet he was the master of this modern marvel. The steady march of progress, with its boundless opportunities and its firm, unbreachable limits, had woven itself so completely into the fabric of his life that he could no longer distinguish its threads from his own. Let the echoes of their quiet evenings settle around you now, a soft blanket of history. May you find that same profound peace as you drift into untroubled sleep. Rest well.